I didn't realize the life I was living wasn't mine until it started to feel unfamiliar in ways I couldn't explain. There was no moment where I said, "This isn't me anymore." Instead, there were thousands of small moments where I felt like a guest in my own existence. I followed the path that made sense. The one that earned approval. The one that avoided conflict. At every crossroads, I chose the option that felt reasonable, mature, safe. I told myself that freedom was overrated, that passion fades, that responsibility is what gives life meaning. I said those things so often that I stopped questioning who they were meant to convince. People around me were proud. They used words like settled, successful, on track. I nodded, smiled, accepted the labels. It felt easier than correcting them. Easier than admitting that I had no idea when this life became something I was maintaining instead of choosing. The first sign was emotional distance. Not from others, from myself. I stopped asking what I wanted because the answers felt inconvenient. Wanting something different meant admitting that years of effort had been misdirected. It meant acknowledging that I had traded curiosity for certainty, and that certainty was suffocating me slowly. I became very good at functioning. I showed up. I fulfilled expectations. I said the right things at the right times. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. From the inside, everything felt muted, like the volume on my inner life had been turned down so low I could barely hear it. I remember one evening clearly. I was surrounded by people who cared about me, laughing at something I should have found funny, when a sudden wave of detachment hit me. I felt like I was watching myself from the outside, playing a role I had rehearsed too well. That was the moment a terrifying thought surfaced: if I disappeared, how long would it take for anyone to notice that the real me had already been gone for years? That thought stayed with me. I began to reflect on the choices that brought me here. None of them were wrong on their own. That was the cruel part. Each decision made sense in isolation. But together, they formed a life shaped more by expectation than by identity. I chose stability because it was praised. I chose compromise because it was polite. I chose silence because it kept the peace. Over time, those choices added up to something I no longer recognized. I wasn't miserable in an obvious way. There was no daily despair, no visible breakdown. Instead, there was a constant low-grade sadness, like background noise I had learned to live with. I told myself this was normal. That everyone feels like this eventually. That adulthood is about endurance, not fulfillment. But at night, when there was no one to impress, the truth crept in. I felt grief not for something I had lost, but for something I had never allowed myself to become. I mourned versions of my life I had quietly abandoned without ever admitting it, dreams that didn't die dramatically, but faded from neglect. The hardest part was the realization that no one had forced this life on me. I had collaborated with it. I had said yes when I meant maybe. I had stayed silent when I should have spoken. I had chosen to be understood instead of being honest. And now, I was paying the price. I started feeling resentful for reasons I couldn't articulate. Small things irritated me disproportionately. Conversations felt shallow even when they weren't. I was angry at people who had done nothing wrong because they were living in the version of me I had created for them, not the one I had buried. That resentment scared me. It made me realize how dangerous suppression can be. Unlived lives don't disappear. They wait. And when they surface, they do so with force. One night, unable to sleep, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years: if no one expected anything from me, what would I choose? I didn't know the answer. That silence was louder than any confession. I realized then how deeply I had outsourced my identity. My sense of self was built around being acceptable, dependable, understandable. I had become fluent in other people's expectations and illiterate in my own desires. And the most frightening thought of all followed immediately after: What if I reach the end of my life having never lived it as myself? That question cracked something open inside me. For the first time, the idea of starting over didn't feel reckless. It felt necessary. I didn't act on it yet. I wasn't brave enough. But the realization had already changed me. Because once you see that you are living someone else's life, continuing becomes the most dangerous form of denial. After that realization, I became painfully aware of how much of my life was built on permission I never explicitly asked for but always waited to receive. Permission to change. Permission to disappoint. Permission to become someone unfamiliar. I had lived as if an invisible committee were constantly evaluating my choices, and I was terrified of failing an exam no one had officially announced. I started to notice the pattern everywhere. In conversations where I agreed too quickly. In plans I accepted out of habit. In opinions I softened to remain agreeable. I had become an expert at self-editing. The real version of me existed only in unfinished thoughts and late-night reflections, never fully formed, never fully spoken. What hurt the most was realizing how early it had started. I traced it back to moments where choosing myself felt risky and choosing approval felt safe. Moments where I learned, quietly, that being easy to understand was more valuable than being authentic. I absorbed that lesson so deeply it became instinct. Over time, instinct turned into identity. I wasn't lying to people. I was lying around myself. There was a dark secret beneath my calm exterior, one I had never named out loud. I was terrified that if I stopped performing, there would be nothing underneath worth staying for. That fear kept me compliant. It kept me quiet. It kept me trapped in a life that looked complete but felt borrowed. I tried to confront it logically. I told myself I could slowly adjust. That I didn't need to dismantle everything to reclaim myself. That I could renegotiate my life without disrupting it. But every attempt to change within the existing structure felt like betrayal not of others, but of the role I was expected to play. The more I became aware, the harder it was to pretend. I began to feel like an imposter in my own routines. Even moments that should have brought comfort felt hollow. Compliments made me uncomfortable. Praise felt misplaced, as if it were meant for someone else. I was being rewarded for consistency, not truth. At night, my thoughts grew heavier. I imagined reaching old age and being praised for a life well lived while knowing, deep down, that it hadn't been lived by me. That image haunted me. Not because it was dramatic, but because it felt plausible. The internal conflict reached a breaking point when I realized something devastating: staying wasn't neutral. Every day I remained silent, I was actively reinforcing a version of myself that wasn't real. I wasn't postponing life. I was replacing it. That's when resentment turned inward. I blamed myself for lacking courage. For choosing comfort over clarity. For being more afraid of misunderstanding than of regret. That self-blame was corrosive. It eroded what little self-trust I had left. I began to doubt my own perceptions, my own needs, my own right to want something different. I felt trapped by a moral dilemma that had no clean resolution. Was it right to disrupt a stable life because of an internal truth no one else could see? Was authenticity a sufficient reason to cause confusion, pain, disappointment? I weighed these questions endlessly, hoping logic would rescue me. It didn't. What finally shifted things wasn't a new answer, but a new understanding. I realized that I was already causing harm just quietly, invisibly, and mostly to myself. The cost of staying wasn't obvious to others, but it was relentless. I was paying for peace with my own disappearance. That was the moment the fear changed shape. I stopped being afraid of leaving and started being afraid of staying too long. Afraid that the longer I lived this life, the harder it would be to remember who I was without it. Afraid that eventually I would lose the language to describe my own inner world. I began to detach emotionally, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. I observed instead of participated. I listened instead of engaged. Part of me was already preparing to leave, even if I hadn't admitted it yet, and beneath all the doubt, there was a growing certainty I could no longer ignore. No one was coming to reclaim my life for me. There would be no external permission. No perfect moment. No painless transition. If I wanted to live as myself, I would have to choose it fully, imperfectly, and at a cost. That realization didn't feel empowering. It felt terrifying. But it was honest. And once honesty enters the room, pretending becomes impossible. I knew then that I was approaching a line I couldn't uncross. That soon, staying would no longer be an option I could live with. The version of me that had survived on approval was losing its grip, and something raw, uncertain, and deeply human was beginning to take its place. The choice was no longer theoretical. It was coming. The decision didn't arrive like a thunderbolt. It settled in quietly, the way truth often does when it knows you're finally ready to hear it. I stopped asking if I should leave this life and started asking when. That shift changed everything. Fear didn't disappear, but it lost its authority. It was no longer a warning, it was just a sensation, like cold air on exposed skin. Uncomfortable, but survivable. I didn't announce my choice. I didn't rehearse speeches or prepare explanations. I knew that the moment I tried to make my decision understandable to everyone else, I would start negotiating with myself again. And I was done negotiating my own existence. Leaving didn't mean running away in a dramatic sense. It meant withdrawing my consent from a life that had been built on expectations I never consciously agreed to. It meant allowing people to be confused about me. Allowing disappointment to exist without rushing to fix it. Allowing silence where I used to over-explain. That was the hardest part. I had always believed that being misunderstood was a failure. That clarity was a responsibility. That if someone felt hurt or confused, it meant I had done something wrong. Letting go of that belief felt like shedding a second skin, painful, slow, and deeply unsettling. When I finally stepped away, the world didn't react the way I imagined. There was no dramatic fallout. No immediate collapse. Life went on, just slightly rearranged. And that taught me something humbling. Much of the pressure I had felt was internal. I had been carrying expectations long after others had stopped enforcing them. The emptiness that followed scared me. Without the familiar structure of my old identity, I felt exposed. There were days when I questioned everything. Days when I wondered if I had made a mistake, if I had confused discomfort with destiny. But beneath the doubt, there was something new, a quiet sense of alignment. Like my inner voice was no longer competing with the life I was living. I began to notice small changes first. I breathed differently. I listened more carefully to myself, not just to others. I made choices that felt honest, even when they were inconvenient. I didn't suddenly become fearless or fulfilled. I became present. And presence, I learned, is not glamorous. It's raw. It's unfiltered. It means feeling sadness without immediately numbing it, and joy without questioning whether you deserve it. I grieved the years I had spent living someone else's life. That grief was necessary. You don't walk away from a borrowed identity without mourning the time you invested in it. I allowed myself to feel that loss fully, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement. I also forgave myself. Not for being weak, but for being human. For choosing safety when I didn't know another way. For adapting in environments where authenticity felt risky. Self-betrayal, I realized, is often a survival strategy learned too early and unlearn it too late. The future didn't reveal itself all at once. It still hasn't. But for the first time, the uncertainty feels honest. I'm no longer living toward an image I'm supposed to maintain. I'm living toward understanding who I am when no one is watching. If you're listening to this and feeling that quiet recognition, that sense that your life fits too well around expectations that aren't yours, I want to tell you to leave. Leaving is not the answer for everyone. But I will tell you this, Every time you silence yourself to remain acceptable, you pay with a piece of your presence. And one day, you may realize you've spent years being admired for a life you were never truly in. I didn't start over because I wanted a better life. I started over because I wanted a real one. I was living someone else's life, carefully, convincingly, successfully. Now, even when it's uncertain, even when it's uncomfortable, I am finally living mine. And that quietly, imperfectly has made all the difference.